Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar on blended finance. This is the third webinar we have in the blended finance series, and we are very happy to have you all with us. The particular focus of this session is on a report we recently launched, more specifically the 29th of January, and it's called Making Blended Finance Work for the Sustainable Development Goals. I will be your moderator and looking at the questions that you're sending, so please share your ideas and thoughts and questions with me. But now, without further ado, let me give the floor to our colleague Naida Krishna-Morgado.
Thank you, Jens. My name is Naida Krishna-Morgado. I'm with the OECD's Development Cooperation Directorate, and I work on climate change and green investment. I wanted to ask my colleagues in the room who will be co-presenting with me to introduce themselves briefly, so maybe we can go in order of speaking.
Hello, my name is Berenice Lasfag. I also work at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate on green investment and blended finance.
Hello everyone, my name is Yvko Barzukala. I'm also working in the Development Cooperation Directorate on blended finance and social impact investment.
Hello everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Irene Basile. I work on blended finance and impact investing here at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, and my focus is in particular on monitoring and evaluation. Thank you.
Great, so now that you have all got a small introduction to us, we will start with a short presentation, about 25 to 26 minutes around is what we're planning for, on the new book that we've written, our new report, after which we'll take questions, and we hope to hear from many of you about what you think of what has been about a year and a half of work on this topic. So maybe we can start with the presentation. Okay, great. So why did we write this report? I think after the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, there's been a clear understanding in the development cooperation, development community more broadly actually, and specifically in the development cooperation community, that we need more resources to finance the sustainable development goals in developing countries, and that some of this resource will need to come from the private sector. Hence, there's been a move to looking at more and more innovative solutions to really mobilizing private sector actors. One of the topics that have come up recently, and it's been around for a long time actually, it's not a new approach, but it's sort of in the policy agenda, it's had a resurgence in the last few years, is blended finance, an approach by which you mix different forms of capital to try and bring different types of actors together. There's been a lot of excitement and energy about this in some of the conversations that have been happening in the international community, but at the same time, others have also raised the issue that there could be concerns around blending if we scale it up without properly understanding its potential consequences. Some of the risks some of the questions actually that have been raised around blending is, can it really be used in difficult contexts and environments, for example, fragile states? Can blending really be used across a broad set of development goals? How can we ensure that we blend, use public money in a way so as not to crowd out other actors, and a few other questions. We started our research in this area about a year and a half ago, looking at different aspects of blended finance, and we wrote this book, this report over the last 6 months to try and give our stake based on the information we had collected and the research we had done, our take on what will it take to make blended finance work for the Sustainable Development Goals. Our research included many different things in case studies of projects. We did a survey of blended finance funds and facilities. We looked at donor practice on blended finance, talked to our members. We did desk research on monitoring and evaluation and other issues like tracking, etc. And just to give you a bit of context, at the OECD, our team here works for the Development Cooperation Directorate, as we've mentioned before, and our membership, our countries that we work to, is the Development Assistance Committee, which is the major providers of official development assistance and other forms of official finance. So this topic, we approach this topic really from the context of donor policymakers and from the context of development cooperation providers. And our book is really written towards that audience as well, but it's relevant for a broader community of development practitioners. So to start with, just to let you know, we're going to take you through a little bit of a conversation about what is blended finance, what we see as some of the things in the landscape of blended finance at this point, blending in practice, a look at pooled facilities, pooled vehicles for blending, facilities and funds, and then a short conversation about some of the issues we see around monitoring and evaluation of blended finance. And finally, we'll come back to what our sort of key message from the report is to the development and the international development community. So to start the presentation, what is blended finance? This is really the trillion-dollar question when we first started this work, because we weren't able to find a single definition that really encompassed the different ways people were using blended finance. And even when we looked at our own members, for example, 30 members of the Development Assistance Committee, they were all referring to blending in some form or the other and not quite saying they were doing the same thing. So we tried to establish a framework and a definition for blended finance, both through this report and also a parallel exercise which we ran when we developed the OECD DAC blended finance principles, which we did a webinar on earlier. It's another document that was produced in parallel to this one, and it's more a kind of policy principles for donors. So in that process, and it was closely linked with the development of this report, we really went through a strong process of discussion and negotiation and consensus building to come up with a framing that would really encompass how our members were using the term blended finance. And essentially, as you can see from this diagram, blended finance, the way we want to refer to it in this book, and we hope that the community will continue to refer to it beyond, is the use of public money, development money, either public or private, mostly public right now, but there is also some private development money that comes from philanthropies, for example, that use that in a way to mobilize commercial finance, usually within a transaction or closely related to it. And the commercial finance is really key because you want money that, it could be public or private, but you really want money that is currently not going towards development goals or development outcomes. And using that within the context of a transaction or a blended finance approach, strongly targeted towards where there's clearly attributable towards one of the SDGs, so towards sustainable development and used in developing countries. So that's the framing that we came up with, and it's relatively broad, but it is also a way to try and get everybody onto the same page, that we're beginning to talk about and use the term in the same way and also practice it in the same way, and then to make it easier to monitor and evaluate afterwards. One of the, I think some of the key distinguishing, so what's there to think about when you think about this particular framing? A couple of the important points are that we're moving away here from public-private, which is the kind of traditional way of thinking about relationships within the development finance world, really to development and commercial. So it's not really about, it's more about the purpose of the money rather than the source of it. The second important point is the mobilization. You need one source of money to unlock the other source of money. And in this case, if you want a transaction or an approach to be considered blended finance, you really should be able to show that the public or private development money really unlocked the commercial money. The other key point I wanted to mention is moving away from concessionality, because a lot of the previous discussions around blended finance was really we need to use concessional money or money where there is some level of subsidy involved to unlock the private finance, and we are moving away from that. We think we have seen examples in the development finance community where they are able to use non-concessional money, so not necessarily with the subsidy, sometimes given it equivalent to market rates, but just but this money has been able to unlock private commercial money. And in fact, some of my colleagues will bring up some of these examples later on. So we want to move away also from the issues around concessionality in this definition. And we've worked very closely with others in developing this, including the multilateral development banks and the work they've been doing, led by IFC, as well as the work of the Business and Sustainable Development Commissions. We've worked very closely to try and sort through and come up with a framing that encompasses as many as possible. So one quick look at where are we, where is the community, where are we going with blended finance? I think one of the things that has come out from no matter which different research exercise we did, what came back to us is that there's certainly a lot of energy and excitement in the development cooperation community, even though blending is still probably a small part of what development cooperation providers do. there's a lot of increasing energy and discussion about it in recent years. One of the indicators is, for example, shown in this graph, which represents facilities, donor facilities. So they're pools of public money that have come together, usually going towards blended finance 2 or 3 steps down the line. But it's usually multi-donor or a couple of donors, or maybe even a single donor setting up a facility. And if you see the number of facilities that have been launched between 2000 and 2016, based on a survey that we did, but also based on surveys that the European DFI Association did in 2015, you find that actually the number of facilities has increased year on year, with more facilities being launched per year in the last 5 years than, say, the first 5 years of this period. In addition to that, of the 26 members of the Development Assistance Committee that we interviewed and surveyed, 17 of them have blended finance operations in place, and 10 of them are well-established, self-reported as well-established programs covering a number of instruments or that have been in place for a number of years. Similarly, within the development finance community, if you look at the multilateral development banks, for example, there's a lot of energy now also on blended finance coming into the mainstream picture. Within the G20, there's been discussions on how to mobilize commercial finance and the role of MDPs. The World Bank's new cascade approach clearly is really within the context of blending overall, and then places blended concessional financing as one specific aspect of the work that they're going to do seriously. We see a lot of movement now in the private sector window and other agencies doing similar things to really try and kind of centralize blending in operations. So there's a lot of excitement and energy around it. But what does this mean, and what does it really look like when you see how it's being practiced and really put into place? So now I'll maybe ask my colleague Berenice to take over and do some findings from the work we've done on surveys.
Thank you, Naida. So in assessing how blended finance works for this report, we took a closer look at blended finance instruments and structures, because blended financing in itself is not an asset class. In particular, we looked at pooled vehicles, that is funds at the facilities that Naida just mentioned, because they're a primary channel for blended finance flows, but also because they are structures in which we see a lot of the financial innovation in terms of attracting commercial investors. We distinguish between 2 types of pooled vehicles for blended finance, funds and facilities. As Naida mentioned, we define facilities as earmarked allocation of development resources, mostly public, but also from philanthropies, which can invest in development projects through a range of instruments, including purchasing shares of collective investment vehicles. So there's no blending capital structure in facilities. Rather, facilities provide the financing that supports blending further downstream, either at the project or fund level. In contrast, funds are financial vehicles that pose either solely commercial-oriented or more often bring together commercial-oriented and development-oriented investors. Fund can be structured in 2 ways. Either we have a flat structure where capital is repaid and returns are allocated equally to all investors, or a layered structure where risks and returns are allocated differently across investors. And this layered structure allows development finance providers to take more risk or a smaller share of the return, therefore attracting private investment to the fund. One example of such a fund is the one you see on the slide right now is GRIF, or the EIB-managed Global Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Fund, which targets investments in clean and renewable energy technologies. So this is what we call a structured funds of funds, which mobilizes private investment at different levels. On the one side, on looking at the structure of the fund itself, you had a junior share, which was provided by different development providers, the EU, Norway, and Germany. And this junior share was then used to mobilize additional private investment from commercial investors in the fund. And the fund itself invests in equity in specialist private equity funds, where you see also second level mobilization. So you have 2 levels of mobilization. And in the end, the funds invest in greenfield projects. So that's an example of a fund that mobilizes investors at multiple levels. Also, as part of looking at pooled vehicles, we did a survey of blended finance funds and facilities, delving into aspects such as capital structure, governance, portfolio characteristics such as SDG alignment, share of portfolio in local currency instruments, and also monitoring and evaluation of development and financial performance. Through this process, we were able to map, building on surveys that were done in the previous years by the World Economic Forum and the European DFI Association. We were able to map 356 pooled vehicles for blended finance, and we sent surveys to roughly half of those pooled vehicles and got responses from 74 of them. So the graph that you see right now is based on that survey and depicts the number of blended funds and facilities that reported alignment with the different SDGs. It shows that all SDGs are not targeted equally by blended finance funds and facilities. As you can see, the SDGs most targeted by the funds and facilities are those focusing on economic growth and job, SDG 8, infrastructure, SDG 6, 7, 9, and 11, climate change, 13, and goals that cut across others, such as SDG 1 and 17. In contrast, the SDGs least targeted by the funds and facilities were the ones related to biodiversity and natural resources, 14 and 15. This pattern reflects what we believe is a tendency for blended finance to go towards sectors for which the business case is clearer and the potential for commercial gains more apparent. And the lesson learned that we get from this is not that blended finance should be a silver bullet or a panacea that should apply equally in all contexts and purposes, but rather that we need more careful assessments of how blended finance could work in support of different goals, and that this assessment should be dynamic, adjusting on an ongoing basis to keep pace with rapidly changing market conditions and technologies. We're all thinking, for instance, in the fall in levelized cost of electricity for renewables, and so which brings questions of whether or not blended finance for mitigation is always appropriate. I'll now pass on to Wiebke, which will give us insights of blended finance in practice.
Thank you very much, Berenice. So what we also did, which is a big part of the publication, is basically to look into blended finance in practice. So what is actually the data saying about the blended finance activities at the moment, and what are the current models and transactions which are characterized in the blended finance sector. So Naida made this point earlier in the session that mobilization as such is a major aspect of blended finance. So mobilization of commercial finance into development effective projects. And our colleagues here in the directorate are looking since a couple of years into how much private finance is mobilized by official development finance instruments. And at the moment, this data they are gathering covers 5 instruments. It's guarantees, it's syndicated loans, credit lines, shares in CRVs, and direct investment in companies. And on this slide, you see an overview from the latest survey. And we find that from 2012 to 2015, over 4 years, $81 billion have been mobilized from the private sector with the help of official development finance. And what you can see here in the graphic is that guarantees play a major role in mobilizing private finance, and as such are a very effective blended finance instrument. The second message you see here on the slide is also that most blended finance is currently taking place in middle-income countries, with about 77% in upper middle-income countries and lower middle-income countries. So as Naida already said, we need to look more into understanding how blended finance can also work in lower-income countries and in least developed countries. And this is something we take on our agenda for the next years. Really, in terms of blended finance in practice, we looked into data, but the second thing we did is also look into case studies. So what we did, we looked into 10 project-level case studies, where we asked the Development Assistance Committee members to send to us some of their examples, how they are currently already engaging in blended finance. And to that extent, we investigated 10 case studies with regards to their terms and conditions, their structuring, and really conducted some interviews with both the implementing agencies and the private sector. And I want to showcase one of the examples here, which Naida already alluded to. One of the major flagship blended finance projects over the last years was really an Elazig hospital in Turkey, where private finance from institutional investors was mobilized without the help of concessional finance. So this project is really taking place at non-concessional terms. What happened here? The Elazig Integrated Health Campus was a €360 million greenfield project in Turkey as part of the Turkish healthcare program. This project basically enabled, the project basically enabled institutional investors by a couple of big asset managers and corporates with the help of risk insurance, political risk insurance by MIGA, as well as some liquidity facilities by EBRD. So these two risk credit enhancement mechanisms really made it effective that the bonds which were issued by this project company were rated at investment grade and 2 notches above the Turkish sovereign rating. So a really major success of blended finance credit enhancement mechanisms here. When we analyzed the 10 case studies, basically we derived some lessons learned and some insights which are more generic and helpful for the Development Assistance Committee members, so the donor perspective, but also for others engaging in blended finance. And we summed up a couple of them on this slide here. So the first insight is basically that blended finance, and Naida mentioned that already, needs a stronger focus on the mobilization of commercial resources. So in the future, it should really be about increasing the pie, and commercial being there private or public, but it should be really, blended finance should really aim to mobilize investments which have not been directed to development outcome before. And one of the good examples here is the external investment plan of the European Commission, which really puts the private sector at the center stage in the development cooperation efforts. A second insight basically is that we development finance provider bring more to than finance to blended finance transactions. So what we, for instance, saw in this Elazig Hospital campus is that this project, or the project bonds, were basically rated by Moody's, and Moody's really explicitly mentioned that the presence of development finance providers, MIGA and EBRD, made a difference in their rating strategy. So this is, for instance, an example how development finance providers make a difference far beyond their financial resources. Third insight I want to present here is that scalability is important in blended finance. So as Naida mentioned, there has been a lot of donor engagement in blended finance over the last years, for instance, in funds and facilities, and more facilities have been set up, which is a good sign, and a good sign for blended finance in particular. At the same time, the private investors and commercial investors like large-scale investment, so there is, I think, a balancing act to really balance development impact targets with the mobilization of private finance. And finally, transparency, of course, is crucial for fair competition in blended finance. So all private actors should have access to the same amount of information when they engage in transactions. So they should be aware of the instruments offered by development finance providers, as well as the terms and conditions to really enable or establish a level playing field when it comes to blended finance transactions. I will hand over to Irene, who will get into depth in the transparency issue.
Thank you, Wiebke. So indeed, one thing that we observed looking at the governance of funds and facility is the growing level of intermediation. We tried to map the different governance systems that are possible. And as you can see, the result are these 3 prototypes here. The difficulty of monitoring information in blended finance funds and facilities is largely due to the fragmentation of their governance scheme. So for instance, on the left, as you can see, at the looking at the bilateral national level, one government may choose to run both an aid agency and a bilateral DFI, which can also be coupled with an export credit agency. And this adds up to the multilateral channel of blending, of course. In this case, for instance, the aid agency and the bilateral development finance institution have different mandates. The aid agency works with governments in developing countries, whereas the bilateral development finance institution is mandated also to work with private sector actors in developing countries. Now, the issue is that the governance becomes very complicated when the two have sometimes different ministries to report to, different working arrangements, and different requirements for reporting and accountability. The governance scheme is even more intermediated in the second example, where a government may set up a bilateral development bank, like it is the case for Germany of KfW and the French Development Agency in France. And then within these structures, these entities, they will identify a satellite structure, which is the DFI, with the mandate to work with private sector actors in developing countries. In Germany, for instance, this is the case of DEG, and in France, it would be Proparco. Here, as you can see, there are 3 levels of subsequent decision-making and 3 steps in the reporting system. And very often, the bilateral development bank will manage all the reporting and accountability done by the bilateral DFI, but then the upward stream of communication may at times be interrupted or information may be lost, which of course poses questions as to the steering capacity and the strategic decision-making that might be made at the ministry level. And then finally, there are other cases where the governments have not set up a separate development finance institution. This is, for instance, the case of Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia, where at times ministries themselves might establish platforms, such as Australia's business partnership platform, but the emphasis is more on the use of multilateral instruments often. So this very complex structure of governments poses questions in terms of information flows and in general monitoring and evaluation strategy. Very often we see that governments have developed national strategies for monitoring and evaluation of the development cooperation policy as a whole, but this fails to take into account the increased complexity that you will have in blending instruments. The survey of blended finance funds and facilities that we've carried out last year also addressed some questions on the quality of monitoring information collected. So we looked at both the frequency and timing of this data collection, at the type of information collected, and the use that was made thereof. Some key findings would be that, for instance, monitoring information is used by 80% of the surveyed funds and facilities for decision-making on project approval and renewal. So this shows the usefulness of it. But only in about 60% of the cases is the monitoring information actually made public. And this is a finding that is also true when it comes to evaluative evidence. Not only, but even though this information is supposedly used for decision-making, ex-ante data collection on all projects is mandatory for about 80% of the instruments, as you can see in the graph here, 79% in the case of facilities, 86% in the case of funds, meaning that for about 20% of these pooled vehicles that we surveyed, there is no systematic ex-ante monitoring information that is collected before the investment decision. And this graph is even more interesting when it comes to the data collection at the project closure stage, so the final stage, where you can see that if 95% of facilities carry out mandatory data collection at the project level, this is less so for the funds, where it happens only in about 50% of the cases. So this means that when then the same funds will engage into impact reporting or sustainability reporting or evaluation reporting, however this is called, if these reports are only based on monitoring information, it may well be the case that this monitoring information was actually not updated at the closure stage of the project. And then sometimes it is only it's information that is only updated in the project approval stage or at some point during project implementation. Another interesting finding was that funds are slightly more likely to identify quantitative targets, but facilities have a tendency to apply them more at project level, so their reporting requirements are more stringent in general. Not only economic, environmental, and social targets are very widely spread, but governance indicators are much less frequently used, which also raises questions as to how these models actually have an inclusive approach and to what extent this is permeated throughout the decision-making structure. One important finding that stands out and that is common reasoning really is that monitoring information does not and should not cover impacts. However, because there is still a very a lack of common vocabulary understanding concerning development results in the development finance world, there is sometimes some blurring and confusion as to what is monitoring evidence and what is evaluative evidence. So for instance, going back to the OECD survey carried out in 2017 on blended finance funds and facilities, we can mention that facilities again are slightly more likely to perform evaluation. 81% of them do, against only about 50% of the funds. But beyond this differentiation, up to 7% of the pooled vehicles that we surveyed reported that they had never performed evaluation, nor were they planning on doing it, which seems quite a worrying result. Secondly, another interesting point is that donor-led instruments, so instruments that are directly managed bilaterally by ministries as opposed to the agencies or the development banks or DFIs, are the most likely to be evaluated at least once and are the most likely to be subject to compulsory and recurring evaluations. As I was mentioning before, another big issue is the disclosing of these evaluation reports, as only 40% of the surveyed funds and facilities make them available. This is again in quite striking contrast compared to what has become normal practice nowadays in the field of both multilateral and bilateral development cooperation at large. Again, donor-led instruments, so instruments that are directly managed by the ministries, are more likely to make them public, to make evaluation reports public, and the percentage decreased in the case of privately managed instruments, and actually the lowest one, according to our survey, were instruments managed by development finance institutions, so bilateral development finance institutions, where only 13% of the evaluation reports were made public, again, according to the results of our survey. Now, in all of this, the survey results are interesting, but one must also take into account, as I was saying, that development finance providers have very different practices and understanding of what the terms results, outcomes, and impacts are and how they can be used. For instance, many of the survey answers claimed evaluation reports that were actually so-called implementation, impact, or sustainability reports, which are solely based on the use of monitoring information and have not been submitted to a process of either additional primary data collection or triangulation, which one would expect in normal evaluation practice. So there is clearly a need for the development finance world to better integrate existing standards and framework for monitoring and evaluation, which have been established in the wider development cooperation process.
Thank you, Berenice, Irene, and Deepka. So just to kind of close that off then, to take you to, my colleagues have talked you through some of what we've seen in different research exercises and what we've pulled together in our new report. So bringing it up now back to the main narrative, what does that mean? What is our overarching takeaway from this? There are clearly still gaps around blended finance that need to be addressed if we really want it to work as we think it should, as a solution, as a support to mobilize finance for the SDGs and really support developing countries to meet the global goals in the Paris Agreement. What a few of my colleagues have already mentioned, I'll just summarize it. One of the things we've noted is the increasing fragmentation in the governance and development of blended finance that we need to take account of, a lack of data and information on the blended finance flows and markets, as both alluded to by Berenice, but also by Deepka and Irene, and then of course the gaps in the monitoring and evaluation of blended finance, which is key. So both the gaps in data on blended finance flows, so how much development finance is going in, how much private commercial money is being mobilized, how much whether or not this money can be attributed to some kind of outcomes, and then of course further down the line impact. I think issues around monitoring and evaluation practice are all key issues the development cooperation and finance community needs to address if they want to really scale up blended finance. So we've tried to come up with a picture where we presented to our members and especially to the donor community, development finance community, what do they need to do to get to blended finance 2.0. we think blended finance is a solution which an approach which has a lot of potential, frankly, and especially in bringing partnerships together between commercial and development actors, and really scaling up finance and going beyond the pots of CSR related money and really trying to get to sort of some mainstream commercial capital into development projects. We think it has a lot of potential. But at the same time, these are issues that we need to address. The first is blending today. If you see the practice of it amongst our members, it's still largely about using. Firstly, it's a very small part of their operations and their portfolios. So the people that you speak to who actually do operations around blending are a minority in their organizations, even across the MDBs. They're still a very small part of what the banks do, but they could be much greater. But the issues, on specific blending approaches, there needs to be a bigger focus also on mobilizing commercial capital. So many of the approaches we've seen so far is about mixing public money, public development money mostly, of different levels of concessionality, either to support private sector operations or to bring in some private commercial capital. But the focus really has to change a lot for it to be less development money that is used to mobilize larger volumes of commercial finance, and really attracting commercial finance rather than mixing different forms of development money. And that's key. If we really want to increase the pool, increase the pie of development finance, as we've alluded to, that needs to be key and crucial. But of course, as we've mentioned before, Berenice showed very clearly, that is also about clearly about making sure that we know how that leverage ratios, for example, that the amount of private money you can mobilize for the amount of commercial money that you can mobilize by the amount of development finance that you put into the picture, it really depends on the context and the development goals that you're talking about. And you may not always be able to mobilize large volumes of commercial finance in different settings, but you should still use whatever approach is the most appropriate and still try to aim to do it if it's relevant for the context. So the underlying message is it's about attracting commercial finance to increase the volume of overall financing for development, not necessarily about within each transaction, but overall that's what we need to be going towards. The second major point is that we need to be moving from the situation in blending today, which is a lack of wide variation in how it's understood, variation in policy coherence and standards, a lack of standards in how it's applied, really to a place where the development finance community is singing from the same hymn sheet, more or less, hopefully, and with a common set of standards guiding practice, so that we are not distorting markets and that we are trying to ensure that blending is effective in different contexts. Finally, the last one is a lack of evidence and data on blended finance. In the development cooperation community, in the work around official development assistance and related operations, it's a key that we know where the money is being spent and that we know what kind of impact it's resulting in. And this standard has to apply similarly to blended finance, at least to the partners in the picture that represent the development cooperation community. And for us, it's about moving from bits and pieces of different types of evidence, different assessments of blended finance, and really moving to consistent estimates, assessments of effectiveness that are kind of institutionalized or at least done regularly and shared publicly. So we think that the community needs to move towards blended finance 2.0. It has a lot of potential, but it needs to be practiced right. We need to get it right if we want it to really meet the aim of supporting financing for sustainable development. Finally, as part of this work, as I mentioned earlier, we also did in parallel a process of coming up with the OECD blended finance principles, which we believe present a blueprint for better blending amongst the donor communities. You can download these from our website. But just to take you through them very quickly, in the work that we did with a large group of external stakeholders, we came up with 5 important points that the development cooperation community, donor community, needs to be aware of and needs to think about when they're putting in place blended finance programs and operations. The first is very important, principle 1, anchor blended finance use to a development rationale. So as mentioned also before by my colleagues, blended finance is not a silver bullet. It cannot replace all the work that needs to be done to support enabling environments, policy frameworks in developing countries. At the same time, blended finance, it can be a useful tool depending on the approach, depending on the goal that you are trying to achieve. So base the use of blended finance really on the rationale for what you are trying to achieve, and you'll end up choosing probably the best or most appropriate instrument that needs to be used. Secondly, design blended finance to increase the mobilization of commercial finance. Again, something that's been repeated several times today. It's really about attracting commercial finance that is not currently contributing to development, trying to bring those actors to the table, trying to bring those flows to developing countries. So tools need to be designed based really with that in mind. Finally, number 3, tailor blended finance to local context. So making sure that blended finance is really embedded in the context of where it is going to be used is important, even if the money is being brought in from outside. So thinking about issues like local currency financing and working with local stakeholders is important in the development of blended finance. Number 4, effective partnering. So this is very key as well, but when designing blended finance approaches, development cooperation providers should ensure that they're looking at sort of the optimum allocation of risk between partners and build tools that are really crucial from that aspect is important. And finally, as again my colleague Irene has taken us through in more depth, it's important to monitor blended finance for transparency and results. So if development cooperation providers are getting into this space, they need to make sure they put enough time, effort, and energy into monitoring and making sure that results and flows are publicly available, at least what they provide and what they contribute to. So that's the 5 principles. And now I believe my colleague Jens has been compiling your questions, so we will try to respond.
Thank you very much, Naida, and thank you to all of you who have shared your questions. They were a rich set of very interesting questions that I doubt we'll be able to answer all of them in the course of this webinar, but I would like to have 2 rounds of questions, hopefully, and I've tried to block them somehow into blocks of questions. The first was around a bit still the definitions and, example, what is public commercial capital that we included in blended finance? Also, how do you see the role of philanthropy in blended finance? And I think a big question in this regard also, what is the potential of blended finance to provide the intermediation between sort of the big ticket financiers, I think big city financiers we saw, and the needs of grassroots actors and investments? The second set of questions was about the allocation patterns of blended finance, including to fragile states and LDCs, and more data on country and sectoral breakdowns. And maybe a third question set that hopefully we can address very quickly is on additionality, the risk of crowding out, and optimal leverage ratios. So with that, maybe I'll hand it back first to Naida and then to other colleagues.
Thank you, Jens. Thank you, Jens. So I'll maybe take the question on definition and then pass it around to my colleagues, and I can take whatever's left at the end after that. So what is public commercial capital? That's a good one. We basically looked, as I said before, we tried to move away from public-private and more towards development and what's commercial capital. And what we began to see also, partly because the public-private was a very rigid way of defining the 2 groups of actors. So we tried to include within commercial finance what you could include. What you could see is, for example, public pension funds, or say banks that are state-owned but commercially mandated in developing countries. So that could be what you would consider as a public commercial actor. But maybe I will pass it on to my colleagues to take on the other questions, especially on intermediation, role of philanthropy, etc.
Thanks, Naida. So I think the philanthropy question is also a very important one, and we also discussed this a lot, which role philanthropies could play in blended finance. And in this current framework we have set up now, philanthropies are also really among these development finance investors who really have the power to strategically mobilize commercial investments into development projects. So this is something which Naida presented in the beginning, where we really show that development finance money is mobilizing commercial finance. And among these development finance money, we clearly see a role for philanthropic actors to invest strategically. And one of the examples we have looked into, and we had them here last week at a conference, was the Gates Foundation and their Global Health Investment Fund, where they really try to mobilize the private investment and commercial investment into health R&D for least developed and low-income countries. And there, the Gates Foundation mobilizes investments from medical corporates, but also from private investors. And this is a good example of how more and more philanthropies are already engaged in mobilizing private investment and commercial investment with parts of their endowments. Maybe on this intermediation question, also a very good question, because of course there is this gap between the capitals and the local projects and finding local investment opportunities. And I think Bernice has presented that quite effectively. I think blended finance funds and facilities are a good tool how you can really intermediate between the donor money and the local projects, because many of these blended finance funds have local offices in all of the capital continents in the world. And so I think this is one good example, and we here at the OECD, we host another good example. Together with the World Economic Forum, we have established a couple of years ago the Sustainable Development Investment Partnership, the SDIP, which is really aiming at facilitating infrastructure investments in developing countries. And to that extent, part of this partnership is also regional engagement, where we really try to engage with the local actors, local development banks, and local authorities in order to establish a pipeline of infrastructure projects in the field. So there's a lot of intermediation at this stage in blended finance, which is really important to bridge the gap between donors and really the projects in the developing countries.
Thank you, Wiebke. I just wanted to address the second block of questions that Jens introduced regarding our geographical and sectoral focus. The survey that was carried out last year was really a pilot, so it did not cover many interesting fields that we hope to better capture this year. The survey should, and we hope will be repeated again sometime during the summer. But we have some information from the mobilization survey that it was carried out by our colleagues. So you can find it. It's widely quoted in our report, but also as a separate report by the OECD on private finance mobilized by official development finance. And that source, which only covers 2012 to 2015 as a temporal scope, tells us that indeed most of the private finance mobilized goes towards middle-income countries, 77% of it, and LDCs only represent about 5%, and together with other low-income countries, we reach about 7%. So there is this question that has been brought up over and over. We know that there is an interest, and that is why also going forward, to substantiate and gather further evidence on the 5 principles that we briefly presented at the end of the PowerPoint. Our team will take on a number of deep dives in this year and the following one, both specific to the implications, the operational implications of each of these principles, so as to build further policy guidance for the decision makers sitting in the national governments and ministries, but also to collect further evidence. And one of them will be on a specific sector, such as agriculture, another one on an even more specific field, which is the water sector. And finally, we are also undertaking some work on least developed countries together with UNCDF, in partnership with UNCDF. And there will be also a deep dive, which will be the subject of a separate paper forthcoming this year, on fragile and conflict-afflicted contexts. So really looking at what has been done so far, how has blended finance been used in fragile and conflict-afflicted contexts, and what are the specific instructions or caveats that should be taken into account. This work will benefit from the partnership with both the International Dialogue on Peace Building and State Building, and of course the International Network on Conflict and Fragility that is hosted and managed by the OECD. So to answer shortly, yes, we are very well aware that most of blended finance is directed to middle-income countries, and we hope to bring more clarity on the issue of how blended finance can and should be used in LDCs and context situations further next year.
I can take on a couple of the questions, maybe on that there were a few different ones, actually, colleague from environmental finance and also Paris Quinn from on the untapped capital and then maybe the distribution of it and who is the private sector. So on the question on have we done any assessments of how much is the untapped capital for blended finance, and how much is the untapped private capital that could be channeled into blended finance. We haven't done an assessment like that, but we have looked at, we can point you towards where some others have tried to. As you can imagine, it's not an easy exercise to do, and just mapping the blended finance market itself in a robust way has been something we've tried very hard to do with this report. So I can point you to two resources. One is the Business and Sustainable Development Commission's new report. They've tried to map the blended finance market. I think they came up with a number of 50 billion, was it? Something like this. So that might be a starting point. The second is the work of our colleagues here at the OECD on long-term investment. They do an annual or biannual survey on pension funds, and they've at least tried to come up with annual estimates of institutional capital that's out there. Varies from 60, 70 trillion, 80 trillion, depending on the year. And then they've tried to look at the breakdown of that and where the interest of that money is going. And that, again, only represents one portion of the sort of untapped capital that you could, probably the largest, but only one portion of the untapped capital that you could channel. So that's the two resources you could look at if you wanted to. The second question, which I thought was an interesting one, which is, has anybody looked at the breakup of the sources of private, who is the private sector basically? And there is in fact our colleagues at Convergence, which is a platform that's run out of the UK, is it, or Canada? Yeah, okay, sorry, but also within the UK. It's basically a platform that brings together blended finance. They did a report. They have a nice database of deals, blended finance deals. They have some good data there. And in January, a couple of weeks ago, in fact, they released a report called Who is the Private Sector? So trying to classify who the different private sector actors are, what are their challenges and interest points, and how you could mobilize them, or how they could be attracted to blended finance. That doesn't answer your question, Baris, which is really, has anybody looked at the different motivations of the private sector and the different sort of the landscape of the spectrum of capital, but it's an area we're very much interested in. Karen Wilson, who you also referred to, is part of our extended team on this work. And we tried to think about how we could showcase that issues around the spectrum of capital in this report. We didn't, but it was very well showcased already in the report that she did on the building the evidence base on social impact investment. I think we're very interested in it as a concept, but as mentioned before, our focus also for this book was really development cooperation and looking at it from that perspective. But in our future work on social impact investment, we're going to bring out another report later on this year. We'll be hopefully taking that thought process forward. Jens, back to you.
Thank you very much. We have a few more minutes, so I'm tempted to have one or two very quick questions and quick answers to that again. Just at the occasion, since there were a couple of comments or questions on this, so the report that is underpinning this webinar is available online for download or free online reading. Also, we will send the PowerPoint that we've just presented to all participants, so be rest assured that you will get this. And also the video recording will be made available online in a few days, so all of you will be able to get this. Now, coming back to a few just final questions before we unfortunately have to close for today. Just some that we picked up, and I think that would be great to have a few comments on this. How often, first one is, how often do funders choose to invest or target at least two development goals, two SDGs was the specific question here. Another question was on the alignment of blended finance with development effectiveness principles. And maybe finally, what is the plan for the blended finance within the overall process for financing for development? And with that, I again pass back to Naida and then to other colleagues.
What was the last question?
The financing for development process.
What is the role of blended finance?
What is the role, or what is the plan?
I can maybe start with that question and then actually turn back to you, Jens, or other colleagues here who are actually going to try and integrate more. So we'll go backwards with the questions. I can start with the last one, but really try to integrate blended finance into the process itself of FFD. But I mean, in a broader context, within the financing for development agenda and discussion, as I mentioned right at the start, there is a big focus on public-private approaches, and particularly on blended finance. We're working closely with our colleagues at the UN to see how it can best be featured in their work. But I think just from the context of the fact that development finance providers are so engaged in this topic, or beginning to get engaged in this topic now, it's clearly a part of the overarching discussion. But as mentioned before, it's importantly couched within a broader discussion on how to mobilize private actors, which really is also about the enabling environment and about improving upstream conditions for investment in developing countries. I think that's an important point to note, that blended finance is project level, usually transaction level. It can be very important to unlock commercial transactions, and hopefully over time its aim should be to build markets, but it cannot be done in isolation of strong continued support for enabling environments. And the OECD's push into the FFD discussions, our contributes from both sides. So including our work, there's also a big portion of work where we're trying to develop a big global financing outlook on financing for development, and that's really contributing the discussion on the upstream enabling environments work. But maybe my colleague Paul will talk a bit more about our plans for the.
Yeah, hi, I'm Paul Horrocks. I'm leading the private finance for sustainable development team here and focusing on blended finance. So in terms of our engagement with the G20, G7 and UN, that's for us a critical component in terms of driving this agenda forward. We recognize the role that they can play in dealing not only with the supply, so dealing with the regulatory frameworks that impinge and stop the flow of capital to developing countries, but also on the demand side in terms of ensuring that countries have the right policy frameworks and approaches to engaging with the structures that blended finance, DFIs and other institutions can have in place. We've been talking to colleagues here in the OECD, but also with others involved in this. So we do want to see how much we can move forward in terms of building blended finance into G20 in particular, because there's a lot of recognition by, of course, China and India around blended finance, and they're using it quite actively as well. Those discussions are ongoing, and we hope to be able to engage in some of the working groups and talk to some of those governments, and particular, of course, Japan, but also in Argentina in terms of their presidency this year. So that's a bit of the state of play on that. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. And on Valerie's question, how often do funders choose to invest in at least 2 SDGs, support systems change and impact at scale through cross-sector collaboration? Actually, while doing the survey, we showed that actually a lot of the facilities and funds target multiple SDGs, and the SDGs in the nature are universal and interrelated. So that's very important. And even though in our analysis we don't showcase that, we'll include a specific question on that in the next initiative of the survey. As Irene mentioned, this was a first exercise. So thank you very much.
And maybe just that question on the development effectiveness principles. They have been actively involved, or we have taken them into account in drafting the principles process, in particular when you look into this ownership of development priorities by developing countries. That's basically reflected in our tailor blended finance to the local context principles. So we have taken them into account, and Jens probably can talk more about that, but the development effectiveness principles have been set up basically with the same intention as the blended finance principles.
I saw one question earlier on. I've just been scrolling through them on the capacity. Do donors think that they're equipped with the right systems thinking and capacity? I won't try and answer the systems thinking part of the question, but the capacity part of the question, that's definitely a very good one. And I think if you look across both the development banks as well as the development cooperation community, it's clear that more and more private sector approaches, private sector oriented approaches shows up a skill gap within development cooperation agencies and the MDBs, because the traditional mode of operation, as you know, is sovereign operations, public sector operations, working with civil society and non-governmental organizations, and beginning to structure deals like that could involve several layers of structuring, as we've talked about today, and really working with commercial investors, talking to institutional investors, even understanding where they come from and what they need and what they contribute to and what they could bring to the table. Is a very specific skill set. It's a skill set that you find in the commercial finance industry essentially, and other private sector areas of industry. So it's a skill set that not all development cooperation agencies have. That's definitely one thing that we highlighted in some work we did last year when we looked at what are the lessons learned across development cooperation agencies in engaging the private sector. So there is a skill gap, I think, and this is increasingly being recognized. The second issue is, of course, internal incentives within development cooperation agencies, but more so within development banks, where the incentives for staff is not about mobilizing commercial money or even working with commercial money. It's really about projects that are being dispersed and committed. So there are issues really about internal incentives that also need to be addressed if you want blended finance to take off and have some scale up within institutions. So there's been some work around this, and in fact last week we hosted a training here for 2 days where we worked with our colleagues at Convergence to try and bring at least our members to the table to hear about blended finance, to understand a bit more about what it's about, to understand what are some of the issues around it. And there were some very interesting discussions, especially from members who have no blended finance operations but are really thinking about starting them, on where they can start, what could be the easy instrument to start with, where could they try and apply this, what kind of evidence they need to bring this to their own taxpayers. So there were some interesting discussions around that.
Thank you very much again. I think with that we have exhausted the time available to us. Thank you again so much for joining us for this webinar. We certainly haven't been able to answer all of your questions. To some of them we do have the answers, to some of them we still don't and need to do further work. But please continue to engage and share your questions and your ideas. Also, if you have other ideas for presenting the report, we have done this in Paris at the OECD, but we're also open to ideas for doing this in other places. So again, your suggestions will be very welcome. To conclude, again, the report is already available online and you can access it. You will also get the PowerPoint presentation that we use for this webinar, as well as the video. And with that, thanks so much again, and we look forward to staying in touch with you and taking you with us on the blended finance journey. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.